The stagecoach lurched, a final, bone-jarring complaint against the Wyoming dirt. It was not a town, just a station, a raw plank building and a water tower, looking like an apology to the prairie. Nora waited until the other passengers, two drummers smelling of cheap whiskey and desperation, had climbed down. She gathered what little pride she had left and descended into the wind. It hit her immediately. This wind, it did not gust, it pressed, a constant physical weight that stole the breath and tore at the loose threads of her dress. The hem, already snagged and ripped from a hurried escape from the coach miles back, whipped around her ankles. She clutched the thin handle of her carpet bag, the only thing in the world that was hers, and tasted the alkali dust on her lips. Hope, which had been a flickering candle flame for weeks, was now just cold wax. This was the place. This was the end of the line. A man stood beside a heavy farm wagon, his shape solid against the vast, pale sky. He did not move as she approached, just watched. He was tall, taller than she had expected, and built of the same hard materials as the land around him. His hat was pulled low, but she could see the weathered lines around his eyes. He wore canvas pants, worn boots, and a silence that was deeper than the prairie. This had to be him, Elias Monroe. She stopped a few feet away, her throat tight with dust and fear. "Mr. Monroe?" He nodded once. His gaze was not unkind, but it was not kind either. It was assessing. It was the look a man gave a horse he was thinking of buying, checking for broken wind or a bad leg. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, rough, like stones dragging in a dry creek bed. He stepped forward and took her bag from her hand. His fingers brushed hers. His hand was huge, the knuckles scarred, the skin like cured leather. Her own hand, though chapped and raw, felt small and useless against his. He offered his hand, not in greeting, but as a formality. Nora put her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, brief, and cautious. He did not squeeze, but she could feel the power in it. He was not used to softness, and she realized, with a cold sickness in her stomach, was no longer soft. He loaded her bag onto the wagon bed. "It is a long ride," he said. It was not an apology, just a fact. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, a rough, wooden bench. His touch at her elbow was impersonal, strong, and over in an instant. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, the mules started walking. The stagecoach, already turning, was a memory before they had cleared the station yard. The silence began then. It stretched out across the miles of dry plains, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the high, thin cry of the wind. Nora had never seen such emptiness. The land was not flat. It rolled and dipped, covered in brown grass and pale green scrub that smelled like bitterness. In the far distance, mountains rose up, jagged and purple, looking less like salvation and more like a row of broken teeth. The sky was enormous, a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to go on forever, pressing down on them. She felt exposed, a tiny speck crawling across an indifferent landscape. This land, she thought, was hostile. It did not want people. It wanted to scour them away with wind and sun. Elias Monroe did not speak. He watched the horizon, his quiet eyes scanning the ridges. Once, he pointed with his chin. Antelope. Nora squinted, finally seeing a small cluster of tan shapes flowing over a distant hill, disappearing like water sinking into sand. She tried to think of what to say. The letters she had supposedly written, the letters that had brought her here, had been full of hopeful, domestic things. She had seen them. Her guardian had shown her the copies before putting her on the train east. His last cruel little joke. "I long for a quiet home." The elegant script had read, "I am skilled in keeping house and am of a gentle disposition." Looking at the hard-faced man beside her and the unforgiving land around them, Nora knew she possessed neither of those things. She was a runaway, a fraud, and she was terrified. What would this man do when he realized she was not the woman in the letters? They rode for hours. The sun began to dip, painting the cruel mountains in shades of orange and blood red. The air grew colder. Nora pulled her thin shawl tighter, but it offered no real warmth against the wind's edge. Just when she thought the darkness would swallow them whole on the open prairie. He turned the mules toward a shallow valley. The ranch was not what she expected. There was no grand house. There was a long, low barn, built of rough-hewn logs, and a house that seemed to have grown from the dirt itself. It, too, was made of logs, with a sod roof and small, deep-set windows. A curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, the only sign of welcome. The place was isolated. There was nothing else in sight. No neighbors, no other lights. Just the immense, darkening bowl of the sky and the sighing of the wind through the cottonwoods that huddled by a near-dry creek. The emptiness of the plains was one thing. The deep, profound loneliness of this valley was another. It unnerved her. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop near the house. "We are here." He got down and came around to her side before he could help her. Nora slid off the bench, her legs stiff and aching. She nearly stumbled, and his hand shot out, steadying her by the arm. Again. The touch was brief, strong, and devoid of comfort. He retrieved her bag. "Walt is in the high pasture. He will be back tomorrow." She did not know who Walt was. She just nodded, looking around. The house was small. The barn was large. And then she saw it. Behind the barn, near the creek bed, stood a small, fenced-in square of earth. A single wooden cross, weathered to silver, stood at one end, a grave. A coldness deeper than the evening air settled over Nora. His late wife's. "Inside," he said, gesturing to the house. The main room was dark, warm, and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. A fire burned in a large stone hearth. It was clean, but sparse. A table with 2 chairs, a few shelves holding tins and sacks, a rifle resting on pegs by the door. It was a man's room, practical and stark. Elias gestured to the table. "Sit." He moved to the stove, poured coffee from a blackened pot into a tin mug, and set it in front of her. He did not get one for himself. He stood by the hearth, the firelight catching the hard planes of his face. "The letters you wrote," he began, his voice flat. "They spoke of your family in Ohio." Nora's hands tightened around the warm mug. She could not drink. "Mr. Monroe." "The last letter," he continued, ignoring her. "The one that came with the stage ticket. It was different. The handwriting." Nora stared into the mug. The truth was a stone in her throat. "I was not raised in Ohio," she whispered. She looked up, forcing herself to meet his quiet, steady gaze. "I was a ward of my uncle in Kansas, my guardian, after my parents passed." Elias said nothing. He just watched her, waiting. He wanted me gone. I was a burden. He found your advertisement in a paper, the one for a wife." She swallowed, the shame burning hot. "I did not write any of those letters. Mr. Monroe, he hired a woman in town to write them. He forged my name. He told me I was coming here to be a housekeeper." She looked down again. "He only told me the truth, that it was a mail-order marriage. When he put me on the coach, he said it did not matter what I wanted. He was rid of me." The silence that followed was heavier than the wagon ride. The fire crackled. The wind moaned around the corners of the house. Elias looked away from her, toward the fire. He seemed to be studying the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I see." He had been cheated, just as she had been. He had bargained for a gentle woman skilled in housekeeping. He had gotten Nora, who knew only how to be silent and how to flinch. "I have no money for a ticket back," she said, her voice trembling but low. "But I will not hold you to a bargain made on a lie. If you take me back to the station, I will find work. I can clean. I can... There is no work at the station. He cut her off. He turned back to her. His face was impossible to read. It was not anger. It was resignation, as if he, too, were at the end of a line. You have nowhere to go, he stated. It was not a question. It was the truth. She had fled her guardian's house, a place of heavy hands and whispered threats. There was nothing behind her but misery. Ahead of her was this man, this empty land, and a grave behind the barn. No, she said, her voice barely audible. Nowhere safe. Elias nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. The preacher is in town for 2 more days. Reverend Hale, I told him to be here this evening. Nora's breath caught. This evening? No sense in waiting. A woman alone at the ranch, with me in the hands. The gossip would be bad. It is better to have it done. He looked at the door, as if expecting the preacher already. I can offer you a roof, food, my name. It is not much, but it is better than the wind. He was offering her an out, of a sort. He was offering her the truth of their situation. A transaction. She would be Mrs. Monroe, and in return, she would not be homeless and hunted on the prairie. I will not be the wife you wanted, she said, needing him to know. The woman in those letters is not me. I am aware of that, ma'am. He paused, and for a moment, something almost like sorrow crossed his face. The woman I wanted is in the ground out back. What I need is a wife, to make this place a home again, or try to. Nora looked at his large, calloused hands, at the rifle on the wall, at the deep loneliness of the room. She saw her own desperation mirrored in his practical, joyless proposal. All right, she whispered. Elias. An hour later, Reverend Hale arrived, a small, bird-like man who looked cold despite his thick coat. The ceremony was performed standing by the hearth. Elias's ranch hand, Walt, had apparently returned, a short, grizzled man who smelled of horses and snow. He and the preacher were the witnesses. Nora stood in her torn traveling dress. Elias stood in his work clothes. The words were spoken, to have and to hold, till death do us part. Nora felt nothing. It was like watching 2 strangers from a great distance. She said, I do, Elias said. I do. His voice was firm. The preacher drank a quick cup of coffee, accepted a small pouch of coins from Elias, and left, taking Walt with him to the bunkhouse. And then they were alone again, husband and wife. The silence was different now. It was charged, awkward, and brittle. The small cabin, which had 1 main room and a small, curtained-off alcove with a bed, seemed to shrink. Elias busied himself with the fire, adding a log he did not need to add. Nora stood by the table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She did not know the rules of this. You can take the bed, he said finally, not looking at her. I will sleep out here. That is your room, she stammered. It is yours now, he said. He turned, grabbing a pair of heavy blankets from a chest. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his eyes softened for the first time. You are safe here, Nora, from the wind, at least. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of the last few years was a poison in her blood. He took a step toward the hearth, perhaps just to move past her. Nora did not mean to. It was instinct. She flinched, pulling back, her hand raising slightly as if to ward off a blow. He froze. He saw it. He saw the terror. He saw the shadow of the man she had run from. Elias looked at her, his face hardening, but not with anger. It was a deep, quiet understanding. He stopped moving, very slowly. He laid his blankets down by the fire. Get some rest, Nora, he said, his voice quiet. He sat down, his back to her, and began to pull off his boots. Nora fled behind the curtain. She did not undress. She climbed onto the bed, which was covered with a thick quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The ghost of Martha Monroe. Nora curled into a tight ball, listening to the two sounds that defined her new life: the howl of the wind outside the walls, and the quiet, steady breathing of the stranger on the other side of the curtain. The following days were a study in loneliness. Elias rose before the sun, his movements quiet in the main room as he made coffee and pulled on his boots. By the time Nora emerged from the alcove, he was gone, already riding out with Walt in the other hand. Charlie, a young, loud man she avoided. Nora was left with the house. It was Martha's house. Everywhere Nora looked, she saw the traces of the first wife, the tidy shelves, the worn spot in the floorboards by the stove, the small, cracked porcelain doll sitting on the windowsill. Nora felt like a trespasser, a ghost haunting another ghost's home. She scrubbed the floors, baked bread from their dwindling supply of flour, and mended Elias's shirts, her stitches small and tight, but the house never felt like hers. Elias returned at dusk, covered in dirt or snow, depending on the day. They ate dinner in near total silence. Nora would ask, "Was it a hard day?" "It was," he would reply. He never asked about her day. He seemed to assume her silence was contentment. But it was not. It was fear. And then came the gossip. A few days after her arrival, Nora went to the bunkhouse to deliver the mended shirts. The door was cracked to let out the thick stove heat. She heard voices. Walt and the younger one. "Charlie, he telling you, Walt, there's something wrong with her." That was Charlie. "She's spooked, like a colt that's been whipped." "Mind your tongue, boy," Walt's low voice rumbled. "That's the boss's wife." "Some wife?" Charlie scoffed. "Heard in town she was run out of Kansas, that her guardian couldn't wait to palm her off. You see the way she looks? She's damaged goods, is what she is. Monroe just bought himself a used saddle." Nora froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold, then rushed back, burning her cheeks. Damaged goods. She could not move. She just stood there, clutching the warm shirts, listening to them discuss her as if she were livestock. "He was lonely," Walt said, a note of sadness in his voice. "Since Martha, he ain't been right. He just needed a woman in the house. Any woman." Any woman. Nora turned, her steps silent in the thin snow, and walked back to the house. She did not cry. The tears had frozen inside her long ago. She folded the shirts and placed them on Elias's chair by the fire. Her pride was a wounded thing, but it was not broken. She would not give them the satisfaction of her sorrow. She just held her head high and kept scrubbing a floor that was already clean. The tension in the small house grew. Elias must have felt her withdrawal, the new layer of ice that had formed around her. But he said nothing. He just slept by the fire, a silent guardian, and she slept in Martha's bed, a silent prisoner. Then the blizzard came. It did not start slowly. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, turned to a flat, bruised gray in the space of an hour. The wind, usually a constant moan, began to scream. Elias and his men burst into the yard, their faces red and raw, shouting to be heard over the gale. "The herd!" Elias yelled, running toward the barn. "They're drifting south. If they hit the canyon, we lose them all." "The new calves are in the east pasture," Walt bellowed back, fighting the wind. Nora watched from the window as the air turned white. This was not snow. It was a solid, churning wall of ice and wind. She saw Elias and Walt saddle fresh horses, their movements frantic. Charlie was struggling to get the barn doors shut. Elias was tying a rope from the barn to the house, a lifeline so they could find their way back in the whiteout. Nora made a choice. She did not think about it. She simply moved. She grabbed her thin shawl, but threw it down. It was useless. She grabbed one of Elias's heavy canvas coats hanging by the door. It swallowed her, but it was warm. She wrapped her hands in spare scraps of burlap and plunged out the door, grabbing the new rope just as Elias turned from the barn. He stopped, his eyes widening in shock. The wind tore the breath from her lungs. "Go inside," he roared over the storm. "This is not for you." "You need help," she shouted back, her voice thin and stolen by the wind. "The calves." "Nora, damn it, get back in the house." He grabbed her arm. "I am not made of glass," she screamed, pulling free. "I can help. Show me." For a second, he stared at her. Her hair was torn from its bun, whipping across her face. Her eyes were fierce, terrified, but resolute. She was not the flinching woman from their wedding night. She was not the damaged bride from the bunkhouse. She was just there, ready. He did not have time to argue. He nodded, sharp and quick. "The barn. Walt, she'll help you with the calves you brought in. They're freezing. Rub them down. Force the warm milk into them if you have to." He pointed to the barn, then turned and vanished into the white hell, following the line of rope toward the drifting herd. Nora scrambled to the barn. Inside, it was chaos. Walt and Charlie had managed to push half a dozen newborn calves into the stalls, their mothers lowing in terror. The animals were covered in ice, shivering so hard they could barely stand. "Get the sacks," Walt yelled at her, his face grim. "Rub them. Hard. We cannot let them go down." For hours, they worked. Nora's arms burned. Her hands, even wrapped, were numb, then screaming with pain as the blood returned. She was kicked by a frantic cow. She fell in the muck. She got up. She rubbed the freezing calf until its coat was dry and it let out a weak cry. She forced her fingers into its mouth to break the chill, then helped Walt guide its head to the mother. She worked until she could not feel her own feet. She worked until her back felt broken. She did not stop. She did not complain. She just worked, fighting the death that was howling outside the barn walls. Late into the night, the wind finally lessened. Elias stumbled back in, his eyebrows and beard thick with ice, looking more like a snowdrift than a man. He and Charlie had saved most of the herd, turning them into a sheltered draw. He stood in the barn doorway, leaning against the frame, exhausted. He looked at the stalls. Walt was asleep on his feet, leaning on a post, but the calves were alive. They were standing, huddled against their mothers. And Nora was in the last stall, her small body curled against a calf, sharing her own warmth, her eyes closed in sleep, Elias's huge coat covered in mud and snow. Elias walked over. He stood looking down at her for a long time. She had not broken. She had not run. She had fought. He nudged her shoulder gently. Nora jerked awake, her eyes wide with panic, her hands coming up to defend herself. "It is done," Elias said, his voice low and rough with exhaustion. "The storm is passing." She stared at him, the fear slowly fading, replaced by weariness. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled. He caught her easily, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He carried her out of the barn, following the rope through the deep drifts to the house. He set her down by the fire, pulling the heavy, wet coat off her. She was shivering violently. He did not say thank you. He did not say good job. He pushed the tin mug of hot coffee he had saved into her frozen hands. "Drink," he ordered. He sat on the hearth opposite her, rubbing his own hands, watching her. The silence returned, but it was different. The ice between them had cracked. He looked at her, soaked and exhausted, her face streaked with dirt, her hands raw. He saw the grit. He saw the iron underneath the fear. And for the first time since he had buried Martha, Elias Monroe looked at the woman in his house and saw not a damaged bride or a mail-order obligation, but simply Nora. The blizzard locked them in a world of white and wind for 3 days. The snow piled higher than the windows, and the world shrank to the 4 log walls of the cabin. The sound of the gale was a constant, high-pitched scream, a monster trying to claw its way in. Inside, a new rhythm was born. The house was too small for the distance they had kept. They moved around each other, a careful, silent dance. He would wake first, in the dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Nora would hear the soft scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the metallic click of the stove door, the rattle of wood. He would move out into the storm, tethered by the rope, to feed the mules in the barn, and return covered in ice, his beard a frozen mass. He would hang his coat by the fire, and the smell of wet wool. Cold air and man would fill the room. Nora would rise then. Emerging from behind the curtain, she would take the coffee pot, grind the beans, and set it to boil. The aroma was the first truce of the day. They would drink from their tin mugs, standing on opposite sides of the hearth, watching the snow swirl against the glass. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of shared presence. They were two people in a small boat on a white, roaring ocean. She mended. He cleaned his rifle, the oiled rag moving with slow, methodical strokes. She baked bread, her hands dusted in flour, and the warm, yeasty smell was a comfort against the cold. He would watch her hands, small, chapped, but capable. She would watch him as he stared into the fire, his face lost in shadows, and wonder at the man who had buried his first wife and then, by chance, married a ghost. Their clothes dried on a line strung across the room. His heavy canvas pants hung next to her thin cotton shift. The intimacy of it was startling, yet mundane. They were trapped, and in that trap, the first bars of their separate cages began to bend. On the second night, the nightmares came for her. The storm was at its peak. Elias was half asleep by the fire, the blankets pulled up to his chest. He was not a light sleeper, but the sound that came from behind the curtain was not a sound of the storm. It was a choked cry. "No, please, stop!" He was on his feet in an instant, his hand reaching for the rifle he kept close. "Please, do not! I did what you asked! Please!" Her voice was thin, desperate, the sound of a trapped animal. Elias stood motionless by the curtain. He knew this was not a dream of wind or cold. This was a memory. This was the shadow she had fled from Kansas. His jaw tightened. He had a violent urge to pull the curtain back, to find the man who had put that terror in her voice and break him. But he also knew that if he went in, she would wake in panic, and the sight of him, another man, looming in the dark, would only make it worse. He had seen how she flinched. He backed away, sat down by the fire again, and did not sleep. He listened to her muffled sobs until they quieted into the exhausted breathing of sleep. The next morning, she was pale, her eyes shadowed with a darkness he now understood. She moved slowly, her body aching with a phantom pain. As she reached up to the shelf for the coffee tin, the loose collar of her nightgown slipped. On the pale skin of her shoulder, just above the line of her collarbone, he saw it, a cluster of old scars, white and puckered, like faded burns. Nora felt his gaze. She froze, her hand still in the air. She looked at him. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on her shoulder. Shame flooded her, hot and sickening. She quickly pulled the collar straight, her fingers fumbling with the button. She turned away, her back rigid. Elias said nothing. He turned, pulled on his boots, and went out to check the rope. That night, when the cabin was settled and the fire banked, Nora slipped behind the curtain. She lay in the dark, waiting for the memories to come, her body tense. But the total darkness did not last. A soft, yellow glow appeared beneath the edge of the curtain. She lifted her head. He had lit the small kerosene lantern and placed it on the floor in the main room, just outside her alcove. It was not bright, but it pushed back the worst of the shadows. It was a silent, wordless guard. Nora stared at the faint light, and, for the first time in years, the knot of fear in her stomach eased, just a little. She fell asleep, and the dreams did not come. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, the silence was deafening. The world outside was a pristine, brilliant white, the sky a painful, cloudless blue. The snow was piled in monstrous drifts, sculpted by the wind. "We have to check the herd," Elias said, his voice sounding overloud in the new quiet. They bundled up, Nora wearing his coat again, and waded through the chest-high drifts toward the draw where he and Charlie had pushed the cattle. The air was so cold it burned to breathe. They found most of the herd huddled together, alive, their breath pluming in the air. But on the edge of the group, half buried in a drift, was one of the cows from the barn. She had broken free, perhaps seeking shelter, or perhaps just driven mad by the storm. Beside her lay her calf, the one Nora had rubbed back to life. The cow was frozen solid, her legs tucked under her, her head curled protectively around the calf, who was also frozen. Its small body pressed against the mother's belly. They were a statue of ice and loss. Elias cursed, low and bitter, turning his face away. Nora stood, staring. She had fought so hard for that small life in the barn. She had poured her own warmth into it, and the land had taken it anyway. It was the waste, the terrible, indifferent cruelty of it. A tear slipped, hot, down her cold cheek. Then another. She did not sob or make a sound. She just stood and wept, the silent tears freezing on her face. Elias looked at her. He saw her grief, as stark and real as the frozen animals. He did not know how to offer comfort. His first wife, Martha, had cried often, and he had never known what to do then, either. So he did the only thing he knew. He left her there, waded back to the barn, and returned with a pickaxe and a shovel. It took him nearly an hour to break the iron-hard ground. He did not speak. He just worked, the rhythmic thud and scrape the only sound in the valley. He buried them together, mother and child, and kicked the frozen dirt back into the hole. When he was done, he nodded toward the house. "Go inside. You're freezing." Nora looked at the raw earth, then at him. His face was grim, sweating despite the cold. She nodded, and for the first time walked back to the house, trusting he was right behind her. It was another week before the drifts melted enough for a wagon to reach town. The supplies were low, and Elias's temper was short. He rode in alone, telling Nora to bolt the door behind him. He returned hours later, well after dark. Nora was waiting by the fire, her anxiety a tight coil in her stomach. She heard the wagon, the sound of the mules, the barn door creaking. When he finally came inside, she knew something was wrong. He did not look at her. He moved with a controlled violence, shrugging out of his coat and throwing it on the chair. "Elias?" she asked. He turned to the water basin, and she saw his hands. His knuckles were split open, raw and bloody. "You are hurt," she said, moving toward him with a cloth and the tin of salve. "It is nothing." His voice was a low growl. He plunged his hands into the cold water, hissing as it stung the wounds. "What happened?" she insisted, gently taking his hand and pulling it from the water. She began to clean the cuts. "Your face is bruised." He stared at the fire, his jaw rigid. "There was talk in the saloon?" Nora's hand stilled. "Talk? About you." He finally met her eyes, and she saw a cold, protective rage she had not seen before. Silas Hatcher, he was running his mouth, saying things. "What things?" she whispered, though she already knew. The words Charlie had spoken in the bunkhouse, damaged goods. He was telling a story about Kansas. He called you a name. He said you were a soiled dove. Run out of town. Nora's stomach twisted, the old shame washing over her. "I stopped his mouth," Elias said flatly. "He will not be speaking again for a while." She looked at his bloody knuckles, at the dark bruise high on his cheekbone. She pictured him in the saloon, a place of men and whiskey and sudden violence. She pictured Hatcher, a large, loud man she had seen from a distance. You nearly killed him, Elias continued, his voice void of repentance. Walt had to pull me off. Nora dropped his hand. She stepped back. He expected, what, gratitude, relief? She was furious. You fool, she whispered, her voice trembling. Elias looked at her, confused. He was dishonoring you. He was dishonoring my wife. Dishonoring me? She snapped, her voice rising. And what about you? You rode into a saloon and brawled like a common drunk? Over words? They were lies. I do not care if they were the gospel truth, she cried, shoving him in the chest. It was like shoving a stone wall. I do not care what Silas Hatcher or this whole miserable town thinks of me. I have been called names my whole life. Do you think I am that fragile? She shoved him again. Tears of anger, not sorrow, blurring her vision. What if he had a gun, Elias? What if his friends had joined in? What if they had killed you, all for my honor? She struck his chest with her fist. You would leave me. You would leave me here alone, a widow, with nothing, for pride, for words. You are a selfish, stupid man. He grabbed her wrists, stopping her assault. He was breathing hard, stunned by her fury. She was not weeping for her reputation. She was raging for him. He stared down at her, her small, fierce face streaked with tears, her chest heaving, and he understood. She was not afraid of the gossip. She was terrified of losing him. She was terrified of being alone again, undefended, in this harsh land. He was her anchor, her only safety, and he had risked himself for something as flimsy as a name. The anger drained out of her as quickly as it had come, leaving her shaking, her wrists still in his grip. You cannot, she whispered, her voice breaking. You cannot leave me. Do not risk yourself. Not for me. His grip on her wrists softened. He slowly pulled her closer. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as Martha's replacement, not as a mail-order obligation, but as Nora, this terrified, brave, broken woman who had just defended his life against his own pride. He did not let go. He held her there, in the middle of the room, until her trembling subsided. He said nothing, but his silence was an answer. That night, the tension in the cabin was a living thing. The air was thick with unspoken truths. He banked the fire. She stood by the curtain, her hands clasped. The lantern on the floor remained unlit. The ritual of their separate beds felt like a lie. Elias did not lie down. He walked over to her. He stood in front of her, so close she could feel the heat from his body. He smelled of pine soap and the cold night air. Nora, he said, his voice quiet. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, uncertain. He lifted his hand, the one she had cleaned, and gently, so gently she barely felt it, he touched her face. His calloused, rough thumb traced the line of her jaw. She trembled. Her instinct, born of years of pain, was to pull back, to flinch, to run. But she did not. She had seen his rage for her, and she had seen his understanding. This touch was different. It was not a demand. It was a question. She closed her eyes and leaned into his hand, a movement so small it was barely perceptible. It was all the answer he needed. He paused, giving her every chance to change her mind. Then, he bent his head and kissed her. It was not a passionate kiss. It was hesitant, chaste. He kissed her forehead, her temple. His lips were dry, chapped. He kissed the corner of her eye, tasting the salt of her tears. She did not move, just breathed, her hands flat against his chest. He slowly, carefully, pulled back the curtain to the alcove. He did not pull her or lead her. He simply stepped back, holding the curtain open, and waited. Nora looked at the bed, Martha's bed, and then at him. She made her choice. She walked past him, into the small, dark space. He followed, letting the curtain fall, plunging the alcove into near darkness, lit only by the faint red glow of the fire's embers. She sat on the edge of the mattress. He sat beside her. They did not undress. He just put his arm around her, pulling her against his side. She rested her head on his shoulder, her body stiff. He said nothing, just held her. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the house settle, to the wind picking up outside. After a while, he lay back, pulling her with him. So they were lying on top of the quilt, side by side. He kept his arm around her. She was rigid for a moment. Then, with a long, shaky sigh, she relaxed against him. She tucked her face into his neck. He felt the dampness of her breath, the light tremble that still ran through her. It was not lust. It was something far more fragile and desperate. It was the simple, profound warmth of another human body. It was shelter. They were two broken, lonely people, finding a small measure of peace in each other. Finally, truly, not being alone. The next morning, Nora woke first. She was still in his arms, in Martha's bed. Sometime in the night, he had pulled the quilt over both of them. His breathing was deep and even. His face, in sleep, was younger. The hard lines softened. She lay there, watching him, no longer afraid. When he woke, his eyes opened and found hers immediately. The awkwardness returned. Sharp and sudden. They were man and wife, but they were strangers. He sat up, clearing his throat. "I should check the stock." "I will make coffee," she said quietly. The day passed. The new, fragile bond between them was like thin ice. They stepped carefully, afraid to break it. After the noon meal, Elias went outside. Nora watched him from the window. He paced a patch of bare ground near the south side of the house, a spot sheltered from the north wind by the cabin itself, a spot that caught the most sun. He disappeared into the barn and came back with the pickaxe and shovel. He began to work. The ground was still hard, winter's grip not yet broken. He hacked at the frozen soil, his breath pluming. He dug up rocks and piled them to one side. He worked all afternoon, with the same grim determination he had used to dig the grave for the cow. By evening, he had cleared a small, rectangular plot. He had used the rocks to build a low wall around it. It was a garden, a promise. He came inside, tired, his hands covered in dirt. He did not mention it. He just washed his face. But Nora knew. He was building her a garden plot, planting a root for her, a reason to look toward spring. It was the first gesture of trust, the first true gift he had ever given her. A few days later, the wagon was loaded. They were out of flour, salt, and coffee. "We ride to town," Elias said. "Not I. We—" Nora's stomach clenched. Go back there, to the whispers, to the man he had beaten? She looked at the garden plot outside the window. She looked at his healing knuckles. She went to the chest and pulled out her one good dress, the dark blue wool she had arrived in. She brushed it, fixed her hair, and met him at the wagon. They rode in silence, but it was a different silence. He sat solid beside her, his presence a shield. When they pulled onto the main street, the town seemed to stop. Silas Hatcher was on the saloon porch, his face a swollen, bruised mess. His eyes narrowed when he saw them, two dark slits of hatred. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, but he did not speak. Nora kept her eyes forward. They stopped at the mercantile. Elias got down and came around to her side. As he helped her down, she saw them, two women, bundled in shawls, standing on the boardwalk. They stopped talking. They stared. Their eyes were cold, full of judgment. "That's her, the one from Kansas, Monroe's soiled bride." The whispers were as loud as shouts in the quiet street. Nora faltered, her foot pausing on the step. She felt the blood rush to her face, the familiar, hot sting of shame. Elias was behind her. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He just waited, his presence a solid, unmoving wall at her back. Nora stopped. She thought of the blizzard, of her hands, raw and bleeding from rubbing the calf. She thought of the frozen cow and the hardness of this land. She thought of Elias, his knuckles split open for her. This town, these women, they had not survived what she had survived. She took a deep breath. She lifted her chin. She looked past the staring women, her gaze fixed on the mercantile door. She put her foot on the boardwalk and walked, her back straight, into the store. Elias stood by the wagon, watching her go. He watched her face down the whispers, her small figure defiant and unbroken. He saw her refuse to be shamed, refuse to hide. She was not the gentle woman from the letters. She was not the weeping ghost of his first wife. She was Nora. She was fire and iron, forged in a hell he could only guess at. And as he stood on that dusty boardwalk, watching his wife, he felt a swell of something hot and sharp in his chest. It was not just duty. It was not just possession. It was pride. And it was, he realized with a jolt that both thrilled and frightened him, something that felt an awful lot like love. Spring did not come gently to Wyoming. It fought its way through the snow. A slow, muddy battle that left the plains a sodden mess. The wind was still cold, but it no longer carried the sting of ice. It carried, instead, the smell of damp earth and the promise of thaw. Inside the cabin, a different kind of thaw had taken place. The small, curtained alcove was now just a place to hang clothes. Nora and Elias shared the bed. It was a change that had happened without words. After the night of his confession, he had simply taken the blankets from the hearth and stored them in the chest. And that night, he had come to bed. The nights were still hesitant. He was a large man, cautious in his movements, terrified of startling her. She was a small woman, learning night by night, to not flinch at a sudden movement, to accept the simple, solid warmth of him beside her. Sometimes she woke in the dark to find him watching her, his face unreadable in the moonlight, and she would hold her breath until he quietly turned away. The house was no longer just Martha's. Nora had moved the porcelain doll from the windowsill, packing it carefully in a small wooden box she placed in the chest. She had hung a sprig of dried sage by the door, and every morning she went to the small, rock-walled plot Elias had built for her. The ground was still cold, but she would stand there, her hands on the stones, imagining green shoots. They had built a life, fragile as the first spring grass. It was a life of shared work and quiet evenings. It was not joy, perhaps, but it was a deep, steady peace. Then, one afternoon in late April, the trouble arrived. Nora was outside, checking the rope lifeline that still hung between the house and barn. A reminder of the blizzard. A wagon was coming up the valley road. It was not a farm wagon. It was a black-topped buggy, pulled by two fine-looking bays, moving too fast for the muddy ruts. Elias came out of the barn, his face hardening as he watched it approach. Nora moved to stand near him, wiping her damp hands on her apron. The buggy pulled up, and three people disembarked. A tall, thin man in a black suit, his face pinched and sour. A woman, also in black, her face veiled, though she lifted the netting as she stepped down, revealing cold, pale eyes. And behind them, Sheriff Brody, his badge a dull spot of brass on his heavy coat. "Broughton," Elias said. His voice was flat, devoid of welcome. "Elias," the man, Mr. Broughton, nodded. He looked at Nora, his gaze sliding over her as if she were a piece of mud on the step. "I see you did not waste time in your grieving." The woman, Mrs. Broughton, stepped forward. Her eyes, the same pale blue as Martha's, were filled with a righteous spite. "You have brought shame on my daughter's memory, on the Monroe name, and with her." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. She recognized the look. It was the same look the women in town had given her. "This is my wife," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "State your business, Amos." "My business?" Mr. Broughton produced a sheaf of papers from his coat. "My business is the paper you signed. The note my family co-signed to secure this land. A note made in good faith, for our daughter's future. The note is with the bank, Elias said. The note, Broughton corrected, was held by my family, and with our daughter, gone, and you so clearly moved on. We are calling it in full, with interest. The air grew thin. Nora looked at Elias. His face was gray, but his body was rigid. You know I cannot pay that in full, Elias said. Not after the winter, not until the cattle sale. That is your concern, not mine, Broughton said smoothly. What is this? Nora asked, her voice small, finding its footing. You are his family. Mrs. Broughton laughed, a short, barking sound. Family? He ceased to be family when he put you in our Martha's bed. We heard all about you, the saloon talk, the filth he brought back from Kansas. You are a fraud, girl, and he is a fool who has shamed us all. That is enough, Elias said, taking a step forward. Sheriff Brody put a hand on his pistol. Now, Elias, let us keep this civil. Mr. Broughton is within his rights. The paper is legal. He knows I am good for it in the autumn, Elias argued, his eyes fixed on the sheriff. The bank in Cheyenne does not see it that way, Brody said, looking uncomfortable. They value Mr. Broughton's business. He calls the note. The bank has to act. You have 30 days to pay, Elias, or they will foreclose. 30 days. They would lose the ranch. They would lose everything. Because of her, because these people hated her, and hated Elias for marrying her. Get off my land, Elias said, his voice shaking with a contained rage. 30 days, Monroe. Broughton smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. He tipped his hat to Nora, a gesture of pure mockery. Ma'am. They climbed back into the buggy. Mrs. Broughton gave one last look at the small grave behind the barn, then at Nora. It was a look of pure, unadulterated venom. The buggy turned and churned its way back down the valley. For a long time, neither of them moved. The wind whistled through the new, bare branches of the cottonwoods. Elias? Nora said. He did not answer. He walked past her, past the house, and went to stand by Martha's grave. He stood with his back to Nora, a stiff, unmoving silhouette against the gray sky. That night, the cold returned to the cabin. Elias sat at the table, staring at the wall, while Nora cooked a meal neither of them would eat. The new, fragile intimacy was gone, shattered. He slept with his back to her, a rigid line of muscle and misery. On the far edge of the bed, Nora lay awake, the words echoing in her head. A fraud, filth, because of me. They passed 2 days in this jagged, awful silence. Elias worked from before dawn until long after dark, driving himself and the men. He was trying to outrun the foreclosure, trying to do the impossible, but Nora could see the despair in him. He was losing. On the third night, she sat at the table, waiting for him. When he came in, covered in mud and exhaustion, she did not get him his plate. Elias, sit down. He looked at her, surprised by the command in her voice. He sat. They are doing this because of me, she stated. It was not a question. They are doing this because they are greedy, spiteful people. They are doing it because you married me, because the woman in town said what she said. If I was not here, they would not have this excuse. He said nothing, just stared at his hands. I will leave, Nora said, her voice trembling, but her resolve firm. She had been run out of one life. She would not be the cause of him losing his. I will go. You can tell them I am gone. You can tell them you made a mistake. Maybe they will give you time. You will not lose this land. Not for me. He was silent for so long she thought he had not heard her. He sat looking at the cold hearth. Finally, he lifted his head. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a pain that went deeper than money. deeper than land. He stood, walked around the table, and pulled her to her feet. He did not grab her, but his grip on her arms was inescapable. "You listen to me," he said, his voice low and fierce. "This is my land. I broke it. I buried my wife in it. I nearly died for it. It is mine. And you." He shook her, just slightly, to make her meet his eyes. "You are my wife. I do not care what Hatcher says. I do not care what the Broughtons say. You stood in that barn. You faced down that blizzard. You are mine. I do not give up what is mine." He pulled her against him. A hard, desperate embrace. "They think they can break me. They do not know me. And they do not know you." He let her go, his eyes still burning. "You are my wife. That is all they will ever need to know." His words were a shield, but the days that followed were worse. The ranch was poisoned by the threat. Elias was a stranger again. He had claimed her, but he did not speak to her. He was consumed by a dark, simmering fury. He was distant, lost in a world of figures and fear. Nora felt him slipping away. He had chosen her over the land, but it felt like the land, and the ghosts tied to it were winning. He began to believe the ranch was cursed. "She died here," he said one night, standing at the dark window. "The blizzard almost took the herd. Now this land, it takes everything." "It is just land, Elias," Nora pleaded. "It is people doing this." "It is a curse," he whispered. And she knew he was not just talking about the Broughtons. He was talking about Martha. Nora felt the terror of being alone again. But this was worse. She was not alone, but the man beside her was becoming a ghost. A week later, she woke in the deep of the night. The bed beside her was cold. She sat up, her heart pounding. The cabin was empty, the door slightly ajar. "Elias?" She slipped out of bed, pulling on her robe. The night air was sharp. She looked toward the barn, but there was no light. Then she saw him. He was at the grave. She pulled her robe tighter and walked across the cold, damp ground. A sliver of moon lit the valley, casting the wooden cross in sharp relief. Elias was sitting on the ground, his back against the simple fence, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. He was drunk. "Elias, you will freeze," she said softly. He looked up. His eyes were unfocused, full of a raw, terrible grief she had never seen. "She is cold," he slurred. "Always cold. Martha, she hated the cold." Nora's heart broke. She knelt in the dirt beside him, the damp seeping through her nightgown. "You should not be here," he mumbled, taking another pull from the bottle. She would not like it. You are strong. You are like the wind." She was like a flower. She broke. "Come inside, Elias, please. It is not her you are talking to. It is me, Nora." He looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "Nora, you stayed." He touched her cheek, his hand rough, cold, and wet with spilled whiskey. "It is my fault, Nora, all of it. The debt is not your fault." "Not the debt." He shook his head, a pained, jerky movement. "Martha, it is my fault she is in there." He pointed to the mound of earth. "She was sick. Elias, Walt told me. The lung fever." "Aye," he whispered, his voice ragged. "The fever, it came on fast, in the spring, just like this. The thaw came, and the sickness with it, and I was not here." Nora waited, her hand on his arm. "I was not here," he repeated, the words tearing out of him. "I was up in the Big Horns, breaking horses for the army, for money." His voice was thick with self-loathing. "For this?" He slapped the ground. "I wanted this land. I wanted more. I wanted to buy the section to the south. I was chasing dollars. I was chasing dollars while my wife was dying." He turned his face away, but she could see the muscles in his jaw working. "I was gone 3 weeks. When I got back, Walt had already built the box. She was gone. I did not say goodbye. I killed her. Nora. I left her alone. And she died. He was not just drunk. He was broken, drowning in a guilt he had carried alone for years. Nora put her arms around him, pulling his head against her shoulder. He was stiff, resisting, but she held on. "Listen to me," she whispered, her voice fierce. "You did not give her the fever. You were working. You were building a life. You are not God. You cannot stop the spring fevers. And you cannot stop death." He was trembling, a deep, shuddering cold that had nothing to do with the night air. "She is gone. Elias." Nora pulled back, forcing him to look at her. She took the bottle from his slack grip and threw it into the darkness. She put her hands on his face. "She is gone, but I am here, and you are here, and you cannot bury yourself beside her." He stared at her, his eyes clearing for a moment, seeing her, the living woman, kneeling in the mud, holding his face, refusing to let him go. He let out a long, ragged breath, a sound that was half sob, half surrender. He leaned his forehead against hers. "I am cursed. Nora, everything I touch, it breaks." "I am not broken," she said, "and neither are you." She pulled him to his feet. It was a struggle. He was a heavy man, limp with whiskey and grief. She half dragged, half carried him back to the cabin. She pulled off his muddy boots, his wet shirt. She wiped his face with a damp cloth. He submitted like a child, exhausted. She got him into the bed and covered him. He reached for her, his hand closing around her wrist, his eyes closed. "Do not go!" "I am not going anywhere," she said. She climbed in beside him, pulling the quilts over them both. He turned and pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair. It was not the hesitant, gentle touch of before. It was a raw, desperate grip. He was not holding a wife. He was holding onto an anchor in a storm that had been raging inside him for years. Nora held him back, her arms wrapped tightly around him, offering her own warmth against the ghosts, until his breathing finally deepened into sleep. The confession cleared the air, but the storm outside remained. Elias woke sober, his face etched with shame, but also with a new, hard clarity. The grief had been lanced. Now, only the anger was left. 3 days later, Walt rode in from town, his face grim. He found Elias and Nora mending a stretch of fence by the creek. "Elias," Walt said, not dismounting, "you heard about the Jensen's place, over on the East Fork?" "What about it?" Elias said, his hand still on the barbed wire. "Burned to the ground. Last night. Took the barn and half the house. They got out with the children, but lost everything else. They are saying it was a lamp tipping over." Elias looked up, his eyes cold. "And what do you say, Walt?" Walt spat. "I say Jensen just got a visit from Sheriff Brody last week. About the same kind of banknote you got. Jensen swears it was set. He saw riders." Elias dropped the wire. He looked toward the mountains, toward the pass that led to town. He said nothing. "Broughton," Nora whispered. "It is a message," Elias said. "Pay up or be burned out. They are squeezing the valley." That night, the quiet rhythm of the house was broken. Nora was mending a shirt by the fire when Elias sat down at the table. He pulled out the cleaning rod, the oil, and the rags. He laid his Winchester rifle across the table and began to methodically, calmly, to clean it. The scrape of the rod, the oiled click of the lever action, was a terrible, final sound. Nora's hands went still in her lap. The tragedy she had sensed since her arrival, it was no longer a shadow. It was here, sitting at their table, smelling of gun oil. "What are you doing?" she asked, though she knew. "What needs doing?" he said, not looking up. He finished the rifle and started on his handgun. "Elias, it is not your fight. The Jensen's fire." "It is my fight," His voice was flat, colder than the grave he had knelt by. "They burned him out. They think it will scare me into running. They think I will sell for pennies and walk away." He snapped the cylinder shut. "I do not run." And primary. She hid her fear. She knew, in that moment, that no amount of pleading would stop him. The man who had confessed his guilt at the grave was gone, replaced by the man who had beaten Silas Hatcher bloody in the saloon. But this was worse. This was not a fist fight. This was land, and money, and fire. She went back to her sewing, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the needle. She tended the animals. She swept the floor. She kept the quiet rhythm of survival, because it was the only thing she knew how to do. 2 more days passed. The tension was a living thing in the cabin. Elias barely slept. He sat by the window, watching the ridgeline. On the 3rd morning, Nora woke in the gray, pre-dawn light. She was alone in the bed. She sat up, her heart leaping into her throat. Elias was by the door. He was fully dressed, pulling on his heavy coat. The rifle was in his hand. The handgun was in the holster on his belt. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice a dry croak. He turned. His face was calm, set, his eyes clear. "To town, to see the sheriff, to see Broughton." "To do what, Elias? To talk?" She was out of the bed, clutching the quilt to her chest. "To end this," he said. "No!" She ran to him, grabbing his arm. "Please do not go. This is what they want. They want you in town. They want you angry. They will kill you. Elias, it is a trap." He looked at her, and for a second, his hard expression softened. He put his free hand on her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, or even of tenderness. It was hard, fast, and tasted of coffee and finality. "Bolt the door. Nora," he said. "Do not open it for anyone but me or Walt. Do you understand?" "Elias, please." "Do you understand?" he repeated. She stared at him, tears welling, and nodded. "Good girl." He opened the door and was gone, vanishing into the gray mist that hung over the valley. Nora stood at the open door, the cold air rushing around her ankles, until the sound of his horse's hooves faded completely. She closed the door. She slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. She leaned against it, shaking, her world reduced to the sound of her own panicked breathing. He was gone. He had walked away, to his death, to protect his pride, his land, her. She thought of his bloody knuckles. She thought of his confession at the grave. She thought of the cold space in the bed beside her. She would not be left behind again. She would not wait for Walt to bring her the news. Her terror solidified into a cold, hard resolve. She dressed quickly, pulling on her warmest clothes, her boots. She grabbed the old hunting rifle Elias kept on the wall. It was heavy, unfamiliar. She did not know if it was loaded. She did not care. She ran to the barn, her movements frantic. She threw the saddle on Bess, the calmer of the 2 mares. Her hands fumbled with the cinch, her fingers numb and clumsy. She mounted the horse, clutching the rifle, and kicked it into a run. She rode out of the valley, following the fresh tracks of his horse in the mud, terrified of what she was riding toward, but more terrified, still, of being left behind. The town was quiet, too quiet. Nora rode Bess down the main street, the mare's hooves making sucking sounds in the thick mud. The rifle was a heavy, useless weight across her lap. She felt sick, exposed. Every window looked like a watching eye. She scanned the street. Elias's horse was not at the sheriff's office. It was not at the mercantile. It was tied to the hitching rail outside the saloon. A cold dread, worse than the morning air, settled in her chest. He had said he was going to see the sheriff, but he was here. She dismounted, her legs shaking. She tied Bess next to his gelding, her hands fumbling with the reins. She left the rifle on the horse. It was too large, too obvious. She did not know what she would do, only that she could not be outside while he was in there. She pushed through the saloon's swinging doors. The room was dim, smelling of stale beer, whiskey, and unwashed men. It was mostly empty. Silas Hatcher, his face still a map of yellowing bruises, was at the bar, talking to the barkeep. They both stopped and stared at her. But Elias was not there. "Where is my husband?" Nora demanded, her voice sounding thin and high. Hatcher grinned, a broken-toothed, malicious expression. "Well, looky here, Mrs. Monroe, your husband's in a meeting, out back." He gestured with his chin toward the back door, the one that led to the alley. The barkeep looked away, suddenly busy wiping a clean glass. A trap. Her words from that morning. It is a trap. Nora ran. She shoved past the tables, her shoulder hitting the door frame as she burst into the alley. It was happening fast. Elias was there, but he was not standing. He was on one knee, his back against the saloon's rear wall. 3 men were around him. 2 she did not know. Rough men with hard, empty faces. The third was Sheriff Brody. But Brody was not helping. He was standing to the side, his pistol in his hand, watching. One of the men kicked Elias in the ribs. "Broughton just wants the land. Monroe, sign the paper, or we sign it for you, with your blood." "Go to hell," Elias spat, blood on his lips. "Elias!" Nora screamed. His head snapped up. His eyes widened, not in relief but in pure terror. "Nora, no, run!" Her scream distracted them. The man who had kicked him turned, a gun appearing in his hand. "Well, what's this? The little bride?" Elias used the moment. He lunged from the ground, grabbing the man's gun hand, driving his shoulder into the man's stomach. They crashed against the opposite wall. The second man raised his own pistol, aiming at Elias's back. Nora did not think. She did not aim. She saw the gun in Elias's holster, the one he had not had time to draw. She lunged forward, grabbed the cold, heavy metal, and pulled it free. She raised it with both hands, her arms shaking violently, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. It was a physical blow, a kick against her hands that almost knocked her down. The smell of sulfur and smoke filled her nose. The man who had been aiming at Elias grunted, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked down at his chest, at the new, dark stain spreading on his shirt. He collapsed, not making a sound. Silence. A terrible, ringing silence. Sheriff Brody finally moved. He raised his pistol, not at the remaining hired man, but at Elias. "Damn you, Monroe! You have ruined everything!" The third man, seeing his partner fall, raised his own gun toward Nora. 2 shots exploded almost at the same time. Elias, pushing off the wall, fired at the man threatening Nora. The man was thrown backward, his shot going wild, splintering the doorframe. And Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of rage, fired at Elias. Elias cried out, a sharp, choked sound, and clutched his side. He staggered, but did not fall. He raised his pistol again, aiming at Brody. "No!" Nora screamed, running toward him. Brody saw Elias's gun coming up. He panicked, turning to run, scrambling for the street. But Silas Hatcher, drawn by the noise, had just stepped into the alley's entrance. Brody crashed right into him. Brody's gun, still in his hand, went off. The shot was muffled. Hatcher grunted and fell. Brody looked down, his face a mask of pale, stunned horror. He had shot Hatcher. From the street, a shout. "Gunfire in the alley!" "Nora, go!" Elias grabbed her arm, his voice a strained gasp. "Get on your horse! Ride! Now!" "No, you are hurt!" She could see the blood, dark and bright, soaking his shirt, running between his fingers. He shoved her. "I mean it! They will hang you! Go!" "They will hang you," she cried, grabbing him. "You cannot even stand." He was leaning heavily on her. The town was coming alive. Shouts, running feet. Brody was scrambling to his feet, babbling. "He shot me! Monroe shot him!" "Liar!" Nora screamed. But it did not matter. Elias was bleeding. The sheriff was alive. Her husband was a dead man. "This way," she said, her panic turning into a cold, sharp blade. She pulled his arm over her shoulder. He was heavy, a dead weight, and he groaned as she took his weight. "The barn! At the end of the alley! Come on, Elias, walk!" She half dragged, half carried him. He stumbled, his boots slipping in the mud. The alley was a blur. They passed the dead men. Nora did not look. She kept her eyes on the barn, a dilapidated leaning structure at the far end of the lot, its doors hanging open. "Inside now." They fell through the opening, into the darkness. The barn smelled of old hay, decay, and rats. Light streamed through the missing slats in the walls. Elias collapsed onto a pile of rotted straw, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. "Nora!" he panted, his face pale as ash. You have to leave me. They saw you fire. You killed him." "I do not know," she whispered, her hands shaking so hard she could not unbutton his shirt. "I do not know who I shot. I shot." "It does not matter. They will say you did. Take Bess. Ride for the mountains. Do not stop." "Be quiet," she ordered. She tore his shirt open. The wound was in his side, just above his hip. It was dark, a messy, weeping hole, and it was bleeding too much. She ripped a long strip from her own petticoat, her hands finally steadying. "Press this, hard, while I look for water." "Nora, listen to me!" He grabbed her wrist. His grip was weak, but desperate. "You cannot stay. A posse. They will form a posse. Brody is alive. He will say we ambushed him. He will say anything." "Let them," she said, her voice hard. She looked into his pain-filled eyes. "I am not leaving you. I told you, you cannot risk yourself, and I will not leave you to die alone in a filthy barn. You are my husband." "I am your death, Nora," he whispered. "I have dragged you into my grave." "Then we will be in it together," she said. She leaned down, ignoring the blood and the smell of the straw. She kissed his forehead. "If you die, I die too. Now press on that wound." She found a rotted water barrel in the corner with a few inches of stagnant, brown water in the bottom. It was better than nothing. She tore another strip of cloth, soaked it, and came back. He was slumped over, his eyes closed, his hand still faithfully pressing the wad of cloth to his side. She cleaned the wound as best she knew how. It was deep. She did not think the bullet had passed through. He started, then groaned as she pressed down, trying to staunch the bleeding. "Hush," she said. "Save your strength. I need to get the horses. They are on the street." "I know." She peeked through a crack in the barn door. The alley was full of men. They were gathered around the bodies. She could hear Brody's voice, high and panicked. "Ambushed me. The woman. She shot poor Hatcher in the back. And Monroe. He killed the other two. Tried to kill me." Lies. All of it. They were turning it. Brody had killed Hatcher by accident, and he was blaming her. She had killed one man. Elias had killed the other. It was self-defense. But Brody was the law. And they were nothing. "Nora." Elias's voice was a weak rasp. "They are coming." She saw them. 4 men, including Brody, pistols drawn, walking slowly toward the barn. "The back," she whispered, pulling at him. "Is there a back way?" He shook his head, then pointed to the loft, full of black shadows. "No, but up. Too weak. No time." She looked around, frantic. There was a small animal door, a low opening meant for pigs or goats, half hidden by a stack of broken crates. There! Crawl! Nora, I cannot. Crawl, she hissed, shoving him. Crawl, or I will leave you. I swear to God. Elias, I will leave you here if you do not move. The threat worked. He set his jaw, and with a terrible, strangled sound, he began to drag himself across the dirt floor. Nora went with him, pushing him from behind. They squeezed through the small opening, tearing their clothes, and fell out into the tall, wet weeds behind the barn. The shouting inside the barn began just as they cleared it. They are not here! Find them! Check the loft! Our horses are at the saloon, she whispered, pulling him to his feet. We cannot get to them. He was leaning on her, his entire weight, and she could feel the hot blood from his side soaking through her dress. We will steal others from the livery. It is just across the lot. It was the longest walk of her life. Every step was agony for him. He grunted, biting his lip until it bled, but he moved. They stayed low, hidden by the backs of buildings, the piles of trash, the spring mud. Nora's heart hammered so hard she thought it would burst. The livery stable was quiet. The owner was likely in the street, gawking at the bodies. She found 2 horses, already saddled, in the front stalls. She did not hesitate. She unhitched them. Can you ride? She asked. I have to, he breathed. She helped him mount. He swayed in the saddle, his face the color of old snow, but he stayed on. She climbed onto the other mare. The mountains, he gasped. Head south, to the highlands. They will expect us to go north, to the railroad. Nora kicked the horse, pulling Elias's reins, and they burst from the livery at a gallop. They tore past the end of Main Street, out onto the open prairie, heading south, toward the jagged, unforgiving line of the mountains. Behind them, the shouts grew fainter, joined by the ringing of the town bell, a sound of alarm, a call for a posse. They rode for hours. Elias slumped in the saddle, holding his side, but he did not fall. Nora rode beside him, her eyes scanning the back trail. The land was open, rolling. They were exposed. We have to find cover, he panted, his voice getting weaker. The rocks up ahead. They reached the foothills as the sun began to set, the mountains rising up like a fortress wall. They left the horses in a deep ravine, hidden by cottonwoods, and climbed. Elias was a dead weight, nor was his strength. She pulled him, pushed him, cursed at him until he moved. They found a shallow cave, a scoop out of the rock face, hidden by a tangle of wild brush. It was not deep, but it was shelter. Nora eased him to the ground. He was shivering, his skin clammy. Cold, he whispered. So cold. The wound is festering, she said, her voice hollow. The fever is starting. Night fell. The pursuit was somewhere behind them, lost in the darkness, but they would come with the light. Nora built a fire, small and smokeless, deep in the back of the small cave. She used the last of their strength to gather dead wood. The air was thin, icy. She covered Elias with a saddle blanket from her horse, but he still shivered. She sat beside him, holding his hand. It was hot, dry. Nora, he mumbled, his eyes fluttering. You shot him. For me. I did, she said, stroking his hair back from his damp forehead. Rest, Elias. My father, he always said I would come to a bad end. He tried to laugh, but it was a cough that sent a new spasm of pain through him. He was right. He was wrong. You are a good man. I am a fool. I brought this on you. I brought you to this, to a cold rock, hiding like a coyote. I am not cold, she lied. I am with you. Sleep. She tended him through the night. She found a small, icy stream nearby and brought back water in her hands. letting him drink from her cupped palms. She bathed his face. She held him when the shivers took him. Sometime before dawn, his fever rose. He began to talk, his voice rambling, seeing things that were not there. He spoke to Martha, apologizing. He spoke to his father, defending himself. Nora watched, helpless, her heart breaking. The fire burned low. She was so cold she could not feel her fingers. She looked at his face, pale and damp in the firelight, and a terror she had not allowed herself to feel washed over her. He was dying. She bowed her head. She, who had not spoken to God in a decade, found herself praying. "Please," she whispered to the shadows, the tears freezing on her cheeks. "Do not take him. He is all I have. He is a good man. He never had a chance. Please take me, but let him live. Please." She kissed his forehead, her lips tasting the salt of his sweat. "I love you, Elias," she whispered, the words torn from the deepest part of her. "Do not leave me." As if he had heard, his eyes opened. They were cloudy, lost, but they were looking at her. "Nora, I am here." He blinked, and for a moment, the fever cleared. He saw her face, dirty and tear-streaked, her hair, wild, her hands, red and raw. "Love," he whispered. She nodded, unable to speak. He tried to smile. You'll regret choosing me. Nora, I am nothing but trouble." She smiled through her tears, leaning her forehead against his. "I know." She took his hand. "You'll regret choosing me, too." His fingers tightened on hers. He smiled faintly, his eyes drifting closed again, but the smile stayed. "Too late, sweetheart." His words, a faint echo of the title he had just given her, hung in the cold air. They were a confession, a promise. Fear and need, they were bound by it. He was dying. She was lost. But in this cold, dark hole, they were, for one moment, just a man and a woman. She lay down beside him, pulling the single blanket over both of them. She pressed her body against his, trying to give him her warmth, her life. He was so hot, burning with the fever. She put her arms around him, pulling his head onto her shoulder. "I am here," she whispered. "I will not leave you." He turned his face into her neck, his breathing shallow. "Nora." She kissed him. His lips were dry, hot. It was a desperate, tender kiss, a kiss of farewell and of fierce, hopeless belonging. It was not a kiss of passion, but of raw, shared humanity. They were two outcasts, clinging to each other on the edge of the world. He made a small sound, a sound of peace, and his body relaxed against hers. She held him, her own exhaustion a heavy weight. She listened to the wind in the pines, to the distant cry of a wolf. She watched the fire burn down to red embers, and finally, still holding her husband, Nora fell asleep. She woke to the cold. The fire was dead. The cave was filled with the gray, unforgiving light of dawn. And she was alone. "Elias?" She sat up, the blanket falling away. The space beside her was empty, the ground cold. "Elias!" She scrambled to her feet, her heart seizing. He was gone. She ran to the mouth of the cave. She saw him. He was at the bottom of the ravine, by the horses. He was trying to mount, his body shaking, his hand clutching his bloody side. "Elias, no!" He turned. His face was a mask of pale, agonizing resolve. He had seen the posse, in the valley below, just visible in the dawn light. Was a line of riders, maybe 10 of them, fanned out, moving slowly, checking the ravines. "They are here," he called up to her, his voice hoarse. "Take your horse, ride, south, as hard as you can. I will lead them, west, back to town." "No, I am coming with you." "You cannot," he said. He finally managed to pull himself into the saddle. He swayed, but stayed upright. "They are hunting me, Nora, not you. Not if you run. Brody wants me dead. Go, live." "I will not," she screamed, scrambling down the rock face, sliding on the loose shale. "It is finished." He looked at her, and his eyes were clear. The fever burned away by pure, stubborn will. "I will not have you. Watch me. Hang." He wheeled his horse, the one they had stolen, and kicked it. The horse lunged up the far side of the ravine, heading west, back toward the town, but staying high in the ridges. Nora reached her horse. Her hands were shaking too badly to untie the reins. "Damn you, Elias Monroe! Damn you!" She got the knot free. She mounted. She could follow him. They could die together. Or she could do what he asked. She could live. She looked at him, a lone, slumped figure on the ridge. Riding to meet his death, he was drawing the posse away from her. He was giving her the only thing he had left to give. A chance. A shot echoed in the valley. The posse had seen him. "Run, Nora, run!" His voice was a faint cry on the wind. She turned her horse south, toward the high, unknown wilderness. She kicked the horse, tears blinding her, the sound of the gunshots echoing behind her like a door slamming shut on her life. She had ridden south for less than 10 minutes. The sound of the first shot from the posse behind her, faint on the wind, had been like a physical blow. She pulled her mare to a stop, the horse dancing nervously, breathing steam in the cold dawn. He had told her to run, to live. He was giving her a chance, leading the posse away, sacrificing himself to save her from the gallows they had both earned. She pictured him, slumped in the saddle, his side torn open, riding to his death. And she thought of her promise, whispered in the dark of a filthy barn. "If you die, I die too." Liar, she whispered to herself. She could not be the woman who ran. She could not be the woman who waited in the wilderness for word of his death. He had ridden back to end it, and he would end it alone. "No," she said, her voice raw. She yanked the mare's head around, so hard the horse reared. She turned the horse not south, not west, but northeast. She did not follow him. She did not follow the posse. She rode straight for the town. The land was a mirror of her panic. The dawn fog was thick, clinging to the low places, wrapping the hills in a gray, wet shroud. It was a bleak, silent, and indifferent world. The cold mist soaked her hair and stung her cheeks. She rode with a desperate, reckless speed, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She had no plan. She only knew she could not let him die alone. She arrived at the edge of town just as the full, watery sun broke the horizon. The fog was burning off. The street was already full of people. They were not panicked. They were drawn by a dark, magnetic curiosity. She saw him. He had made it. His horse, the stolen one, stood trembling near the center of the street, its head low. Elias was still in the saddle, but barely. He was swaying, his rifle held loose across his lap, his body supported only by the saddle horn he clung to. He was facing the mercantile. Opposite him stood Amos Broughton and the third hired man, the one who had fled the alley, and next to them, his face pale and his hand on his gun, was the young deputy, Miller. "It is over! Monroe!" the deputy yelled, his voice cracking. "Get off the horse! You are under arrest!" A crowd was gathering, spilling out of the saloon and the hotel, watching from the boardwalks. They were hungry for the end of the story. "Broughton!" Elias's voice was not a shout. It was a hoarse, ragged command, but it cut through the morning air. You sent them! You burned Jensen! You tried to murder me!" "He is raving!" Broughton shouted to the crowd, his face pinched with fury. "He is a murderer! He killed 2 men! The woman shot Silas Hatcher in the back! Sheriff Brody saw it all!" "Liar!" Elias breathed. He was so weak, but he forced himself upright, pulling his horse's head up. He looked at the faces in the crowd. He wants my land. He forged the note. I told him I would not run. He was not talking to Broughton. He was talking to the town. He was making his case before he died. "Where is it? Broughton," Elias demanded, his voice gaining a desperate strength. "The debt. The paper I signed. You want to foreclose? You want to take my land? Show them the proof. The original note." Broughton's face tightened. "I do not need to show you anything. You killer deputy! Arrest this man." "Show them the paper!" Elias roared, and the force of it sent a spasm of pain through him. He gasped, clutching his side. "Show them, or admit you are a thief and a liar." The crowd was silent. They looked from the bleeding, desperate man on the horse to the rich, suited man on the boardwalk. They were beginning to question. "He has no paper," Nora said. She had dismounted at the end of the street. She was walking forward, into the open space between the men. The rifle Elias had left at the ranch was still in her saddle scabbard. She was unarmed. Elias saw her. His eyes widened. "Nora, no, run, get out!" "He has no paper," she repeated, her voice clear and carrying, her eyes locked on Amos Broughton. "Because it does not exist. He and his wife. They hate my husband. They hate him because he married me. They set the fire at the Jensen's place. They sent those men to ambush him in the alley. Sheriff Brody was with them. He was part of it." Amos Broughton's face was purple. He turned to the hired man. "This is madness." The hired man, seeing his chance, sneered at Nora. He stepped forward. "She is just upset. She is just a soiled dove from Kansas. Everyone knows it. She will say anything. She probably likes having her men fight over her." It happened in an instant. The taunt, the casual, cruel dismissal of her. It was the one thing Elias could not bear. He let go of the saddle horn. He raised the rifle with one arm. The movement was jerky, pained, but it was fast. He did not aim at Broughton. He aimed at the man who had insulted his wife. He snapped the trigger. The shot was flat and final. The hired man looked down at his chest, a look of profound surprise on his face. He did not say a word. He just collapsed into the mud. The crowd screamed. Elias's rifle slipped from his fingers. The last of his strength was gone. He slumped forward, falling from the saddle, and hit the street. "It is over," Deputy Miller shouted, his gun finally drawn. He ran forward, not to Elias, but to Nora, grabbing her arm. "You, stay back, it is over." He knelt by Elias, who was trying to push himself up, his hands searching for the pistol he no longer had. The deputy pressed his gun to Elias's head. "Do not move. Monroe, I swear to God, it is done." Elias stopped moving. He let his head fall back into the mud. He was arrested. The trial was a mockery. It was held that same afternoon in the saloon. The body of the hired man still laid out in the back room. Broughton had paid for the circuit judge, a hard, impatient man, to ride in. Elias lay on a cot in the corner, his wound finally tended by the town doctor, who had pronounced it mortal. "He will not live 3 days," the doctor had said. "Then we will hang him tomorrow." The judge had replied. They let Nora speak. She stood before the jury, a panel of 12 men from the town, merchants, ranchers, saloon men, men who owed money to Broughton's bank, men who had listened to the gossip for weeks. She told them everything. She told them about her guardian and the forged letters. She told them about the Broughton's malice. She told them about the ambush, how Brody had been there, how the sheriff had lied, how he had been the one to shoot Hatcher in the panic. "My husband killed one man in that alley," she said, her voice raw but steady. "He killed him to save my life. The man he shot today, he shot him to save my honor. He is not a murderer. He is a victim. Amos Broughton is the criminal. He used forged debts to steal land. He burned the Jensens. He hired men to kill my husband. Look at him. He is dying. Is that not enough? All he did to protect what was his. She pleaded for justice. She pleaded for reason. The prosecutor, a man paid for by Broughton, stood up. He did not even look at Nora. He looked at the jury. Gentlemen, you have heard a long, sad story from a complicated woman. A woman whose arrival in this town has brought nothing but brawling, chaos, and now, 3 dead men in the street. She claims the sheriff is a liar. She claims our most respected businessman, Mr. Broughton, is a thief. She claims her husband, a man who beat Silas Hatcher nearly to death in this very room, is an innocent. He laughed. The facts are simple. Elias Monroe murdered 2 men in that alley. His wife murdered a 3rd. And today, before all of you, he murdered a 4th. The motive does not matter. The law is the law. The jury was out for 5 minutes. The foreman, a rancher who Nora knew had a loan with Broughton's bank, stood guilty on all counts. The saloon was quiet. Nora stood, frozen. The judge looked at Elias, who was watching Nora, his face a mask of gray exhaustion. Elias Monroe, you have been found guilty of 4 murders. The sentence of this court is that you be taken from this place and, at sunrise tomorrow, you be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy on your soul. Nora did not cry. She felt a cold, calm emptiness settle over her. They had lost. They kept him in the small cell at the back of the sheriff's office. Deputy Miller was the guard. Sheriff Brody was nowhere to be seen. Rumor was he had left town, terrified of what he had done or what might be done to him. Miller looked pale, sick. He let Nora in to see Elias. The cell was dark, smelling of rust and despair. Elias was lying on the thin cot, his hands folded on his chest. His breathing was shallow. They had cleaned him, and the wound in his side was neatly bandaged, but the white cloth was already soaked through with dark red. Nora, he whispered, his eyes fluttering open. She knelt on the filthy floor, pressing her face against the cold iron bars. I am here. You should have run, he said. His voice was a dry rattle. Hush, it does not matter. It does. He reached a hand through the bars. She took it. His skin was cold, clammy. I am sorry, Nora, for all of it. I promised you a roof. I gave you this. You gave me everything, she whispered, her throat tight. You gave me a name. You gave me you. They were quiet for a long time. There was nothing left to say. The anger was gone. The fear was gone. There was only this, a raw, quiet ending. Nora, he said, his grip tightening on her fingers. The ranch. It is yours. The paper. In the house. In my desk. It is my will. I left it all. To you. Before I even knew you. I know. Do not let them have it, he pleaded, a last spark of the fight returning. Do not let them win. You keep it. You are strong enough. I will, she promised, her voice breaking. I will keep it. I will carry on your name. Elias, I will not let them forget you. He smiled, a faint, tired expression. My Nora, you were right. You were never the woman in the letters. You were so much more. He closed his eyes. I am tired. Sleep, she said. Will you stay? I will stay right here until the morning. She did not move. She knelt on the floor, her hand holding his, and watched him sleep, his breathing growing shallower as the night wore on. Deputy Miller did not bother her. He just sat at his desk, his head in his hands. Dawn came, cold and gray. They came for him, Miller, and 2 men hired by Broughton. They had to carry him. He was too weak to stand, his eyes barely open. They led the procession down the street to the gallows. It had been built overnight, a raw, yellow pine structure, ugly against the morning sky. The whole town was there, silent, watching. Nora walked behind him, close enough to touch him, but Miller kept her back. They stood Elias on the trapdoor. He could not stand on his own. The hangman, a heavy man with a dark hood, had to hold him up as he fastened the thick, coarse rope around his neck. Nora stood in the crowd, her hands clenched at her sides. She was vibrating, a single, taut wire of grief and rage. The judge read the sentence again, his voice loud in the terrible silence. Elias's head lolled. He was looking for her. He found her. His eyes met hers. He tried to smile. "He is innocent," Nora screamed. The sound ripped from her, shocking the quiet crowd. "He is innocent. You are murdering him. Broughton is a thief. You are all murderers." No one listened. They just stared, their faces blank. The hangman put his hand on the lever. "Elias!" she screamed. Deputy Miller was standing beside her. He was watching Elias, his face pale, his jaw working. He was ashamed. He was a coward. His gun was in his holster, the leather strap undone. Nora did not think. She acted. As the hangman pulled the lever, Nora moved. She ripped the pistol from Miller's holster. She raised it, her hands shockingly steady. The trapdoor fell. Elias dropped. Nora fired. The gunshot and the thud of the trapdoor were one sound. The bullet struck the rope, not cutting it, but fraying it, making it snap under the sudden, dead weight. Elias did not hang. He fell, crashing to the platform below. The broken rope still around his neck. He landed in a heap, gasping, choking. Pandemonium. The crowd screamed. Surging backward, the hangman shouted, fumbling for his own gun. Deputy Miller stared at his empty holster, then at Nora, his mouth open. Nora fired again, into the air. "Run! Elias, run!" A click. Ellis was trying to move, trying to get the rope off his neck. He was alive. A second gunshot. Not from Nora. Walt, the ranch hand. He was on the edge of the crowd, on his horse, a rifle at his shoulder. He had fired at the hangman, hitting the wood of the gallows near his head, sending splinters flying. "Elias!" Walt shouted, kicking his horse forward. He was leading Bess, Nora's mare. He reined in at the platform. Elias was on his feet, unsteady but alive, adrenaline surging through him. He ripped the broken noose from his neck. "Get on!" Walt yelled. Elias scrambled onto Bess's back. He looked back, his eyes wild, searching for Nora. Nora was fighting. Deputy Miller had grabbed her. She still had the gun. She jammed the barrel into his stomach, not firing, just pushing, and he let go with a grunt. "Nora!" Elias screamed, his voice raw. She ran. She dodged through the panicked, screaming crowd. Walt fired his rifle again, keeping the townsmen back. Elias leaned down, his arm outstretched. She grabbed his hand. He pulled. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up behind him, her arms locking around his waist. He was solid. He was warm. He was alive. "Ride," Walt bellowed. The two horses burst through the scattered crowd. A few shots followed them, wild, disorganized. Elias spurred the mare, and they galloped down the muddy street, past the saloon, past the mercantile, leaving the town, the gallows, and the life they had known behind. They vanished into the open country, two figures on one horse, followed by a loyal friend, leaving nothing but the sound of shouting, the smell of gunpowder, and the shadow of a rope, swinging gently in the dawn wind. The world was a blur of mud, hoofbeats, and the agonizing, iron-hot pain from Elias's side. They rode for 2 days, following Walt, who led them up into the high, broken country, into the trackless wilderness of the Wyoming highlands. He pushed them until the horses were spent and the trail of the posse was long lost, a bad memory in the valley far below. On the third morning, Walt brought them to a place, a high-altitude valley, cupped in the hands of granite peaks, accessible only by a narrow, winding game trail. A creek, clear and cold, cut through a meadow of knee-high grass. It was a place no one would find by accident. "Here," Walt said, his voice rough. He dismounted, helping Elias slide from the saddle. Elias collapsed, his fever raging again from the journey. "Walt, you cannot," Nora began, her voice raw with exhaustion. "I ain't staying," the old man said, not meeting her eyes. He was already unloading their meager supplies. A sack of flour, salt, coffee, and the medicine bag he had grabbed from the ranch. "Broughton, he put a price on you both. $500. For Elias, dead or alive. 50 for you. They will hunt you."
"Then stay,"
Nora pleaded.
"We need—"
"No." He shook his head. "I am too old for this. And I am a witness. I am the only one left who saw what Brody did. I am going to California. Maybe I tell you, Marshal, what I saw. Maybe not, but I cannot be here." He looked at Elias, his face a mask of grief. "He is a good man, ma'am. He deserved better than this." He pushed the reins of his own horse into her hand. "Take him. You will need the pack animal. God keep you, Nora Monroe." He turned, and without looking back, the grizzled ranch hand walked down the narrow trail and out of their lives, leaving them utterly, terrifyingly, alone. The fever nearly took Elias. For a week, Nora did not sleep. She hunted with the rifle Walt had left, bringing back grouse and rabbits she did not know how to clean, but she learned. She boiled water. She cleaned his wound, which was angry and deep. The bullet was still in him, a lump of lead she could feel but not remove. She prayed to a God she did not believe in, and she cursed the land, and she held his hand. She sat in the thin canvas tent, the nights icy even in late spring, and watched him murmur to ghosts. And one morning, the fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear, and looked at her. "You stayed," he whispered. "I told you I would," she said, her voice breaking. Summer came to the high valley. With it came strength. They were fugitives, but for the first time, they were free. They were nameless. The land was their only neighbor. They found a small, ruined trapper's cabin at the far end of the meadow. Its roof collapsed, its stone chimney a crumbling pillar. It was a start. They began to build. It was a task that bound them, word by word, stone by stone. Elias, still weak, could not lift the heavy logs. So Nora did. She learned to use the axe, her small, blistered hands becoming hard and calloused. She settled the logs while he, sitting, notched them with his knife. They rebuilt the chimney, stone by stone, their hands side by side in the mud and clay they used for mortar. He showed her how to mix the daubing. She showed him how to chink the walls to keep out the wind. His strength returned slowly. He began to hunt again, bringing back deer. They worked from sunup to sundown, racing the coming winter. The small, one-room cabin became their sanctuary. It was not Martha's house. It was not a place of ghosts. It was theirs, built by both their hands. The seasons turned. Summer's high. Thin sun gave way to the sharp, golden light of autumn. The aspen trees on the high ridges turned to fire, then dropped their leaves. The wind turned cold, carrying the first premonition of snow. They lived quietly. They spoke more in those months than they had in their entire time at the ranch. They spoke of the future, a small, fragile thing they did not dare look at too closely. But mostly, they spoke of the present. "The woodpile is not high enough," he would say, frowning at the stack of pine. "It will be," she would answer, her hands busy skinning a rabbit. "And I saw new tracks by the creek. I can set a snare." He taught her. He took her hand, the one that used to tremble, and showed her how to tie the knots. He showed her how to read the clouds, how to know when a storm was coming in from the north. She, in turn, softened the raw edges of their survival. In the ruins of the trapper's cabin, She had found a small, leather-bound Bible, its pages warped by water and time. She was not a woman of faith. The world had been too cruel for that. But at night, by the light of the fire, she would read from it. The words, the rhythm of the language, were a comfort, a human sound in the vast, animal silence. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," she read, her voice quiet, "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Elias would sit, watching her, his hands busy. He was always carving. He carved small, intricate birds from scraps of pine. He carved a new handle for her skinning knife. One evening, as the first light snow of the season dusted the meadow, he held out his hand. "What is it?" she asked. He opened his fist. On his calloused palm lay a ring. It was not gold or silver. He had carved it from a piece of antler, sanding it smooth with creekstone until it shone like old ivory. It was simple, thick, and beautiful. He did not ask. He just took her left hand, the one that had never borne a ring, and slid it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. "It is our wedding," he said, his voice rough. I have nothing else to give you, Nora, only this life." She looked at the ring, then at him. His eyes, no longer guarded or haunted by ghosts, were just his. They were kind. They were tired. They were full of a love that had cost them everything. "It is the only thing I have ever wanted," she whispered. She leaned in and kissed him, a slow, sure kiss that held no fear, only belonging. That night, they lay by the fire, the wind howling outside, and he traced the old white scars on her shoulder. He did not ask about them. He just touched them, gently, as if trying to soothe the memory. She, in turn, touched the puckered, angry scar on his side, where Brody's bullet had nearly killed him, and the matching one on his front, where the bullet she had fired had exited. He carried the marks of their escape. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Only when I breathe," he joked, a faint smile on his face. He kissed her. "It does not hurt. Nora, not anymore." They were happy. It was a quiet, desperate, hidden happiness, but it was real. They had a few cattle, strays that had wandered up into the high country, that they kept in a small lean-to. They had meat, firewood, and each other. The world had forgotten them, and they were grateful. But the past never dies easily. Winter came in earnest. The snows fell, deep and silent, burying the meadow under a thick white blanket. The world became small, defined by the walls of their cabin and the short, snowy paths to the woodpile and the creek. The isolation was total. They were snowbound, locked away. They felt safe. It was a night in deep December. A full moon, bright and cold, lit the snow-covered valley, making it as bright as a pale, ghostly day. They were asleep, curled together for warmth under the heavy bison hide Elias had traded with a wandering Ute man. "A sound?" Elias was awake instantly. He did not move. He just listened. Nora woke to his stillness.
"What?"
she breathed. "Shh." The sound came again, the crunch of snow, a horse blowing, its breath fogging. They were not alone. Elias slid from the bed, his movements fluid and silent in the moonlight. He grabbed the rifle. He moved to the small, parchment-covered window and peered out. Nora's heart stopped. She saw them, too. 3 riders, dark shapes against the bright snow. They were sitting on their horses, just beyond the tree line, watching the cabin, watching the smoke curl from the chimney. Bounty hunters.
"How?"
Nora whispered, her voice shaking.
"How did they find us?"
"The smoke," Elias said, his voice a low, cold growl. "Or maybe that Ute I traded with. It does not matter. They are here." He looked at her. His face was calm, the face of the man who had ridden back to town. Nora, the loose stone, in the hearth. Behind it, there is a small tunnel. For air. It leads out, under the wood pile. It is small. But you can fit. When I tell you, you run. Take the snowshoes. Head for the high pass. Do not stop. No, she said, her hands fumbling for the handgun he kept on the shelf. I am not leaving you. We fight. Nora, damn it, do as I say. This is not a fight we win. It is 3 of them. I can hold them. Give you time. We fight together, Elias, or we die together. I am not running. Not again. She cocked the pistol. The sound was loud in the small cabin. Outside, a voice called out, Elias Monroe, we know you are in there. We have a warrant for your arrest, and one for the woman. Come out with your hands high. Elias looked at Nora. Her face was pale, set, her eyes fierce. She was not the terrified woman he had met at the stagecoach station. She was not the weeping girl in the barn. She was his wife, and she was not running. He nodded once. Stay away from the window. Monroe, we do not want to shed blood. Just come on out. $500 is a lot of money. We will even split it. Elias raised his rifle, aimed at the center of the largest shadow, and fired. The shot cracked the frozen silence. The man screamed and fell from his horse. The night exploded. Gunfire erupted from the trees. Bullets thudded into the log walls. Thwack, thwack, thwack! One shot shattered the small window, spraying the room with ice and bits of parchment. Nora knelt by the hearth, the pistol held in both hands, aimed at the door. They are coming, Elias yelled. He fired again, at the flash of a rifle. A curse came from the darkness. The front door burst open, kicked in by a heavy boot. A large man in a buffalo coat filled the doorway. Nora fired. The shot was loud, echoing in the small room. The man grunted, staggered, but did not fall. He raised his rifle. Elias was already moving. He threw himself in front of Nora, shoving her to the floor, just as the man fired. Elias cried out, a sound Nora had heard before, in the alley, a sharp, terrible grunt of pain. He fell against her, his rifle clattering to the floor. The man in the doorway leveled his rifle again, aiming at them both. From the floor, Elias raised his handgun, the one he always kept in his belt, and fired again. The man in the doorway was thrown backward, out into the snow, his rifle discharging into the sky. Silence. The cabin was filled with smoke, the smell of sulfur and blood. Elias, Nora whispered. She was pinned under him. He was so heavy. Elias! She pushed, scrambling out from under him. He rolled onto his back. His eyes were open, looking at her. His shirt, his heavy wool shirt, was dark, soaked, in the center of his chest, a black, spreading stain. You all right, Nora? He gasped. Oh, God, she said, her hands going to the wound. It was bad. It was mortal. She knew it. The shot had been at point-blank range. Oh, Elias. The third one, he panted, his hand searching for his gun. He is gone, Nora whispered, looking out the broken door. The third man, seeing his partners fall, was a shadow disappearing back down the game trail, fleeing for his life. He is gone. They are gone. It is just us. She pulled him away from the door, toward the fire. I have to stop the bleeding. No, he whispered. He caught her hand. His grip was weak. Too late, sweetheart. He got me. Good this time. No, do not say that. I will get the medicine. I will... Shh, he smiled. A faint, pained expression. Blood frothed at the corner of his mouth. It is all right. I am so tired. Nora, tired of running. He was dying. Here in the sanctuary they had built. He was dying. Snow began to fall. Not a blizzard, but a soft, gentle, silencing fall. Fat white flakes drifted through the broken doorway, landing on the bloody floor. Nora sat on the floor and pulled his head into her lap. She rocked him, her tears falling hot onto his cold face. "You cannot," she wept. "You cannot leave me. Not here. Not alone. I cannot do this alone." "You can," he whispered, his eyes fluttering. "You are the strongest person I ever knew. You saved me. Nora, you gave me this time. It was enough. It was more than I deserved." He was shivering. She pulled the bison hide over him, but the cold was not coming from outside. It was coming from inside him. "I love you," she sobbed, holding him, pressing her face to his. "I love you, Elias Monroe." "My Nora." His breath was a shallow sigh. He looked past her, toward the open door, at the snow falling softly in the moonlight. It's so quiet." His hand, which had been clutching hers, went slack. His eyes, fixed on the snow, went vacant. He was gone. Nora sat there for hours, holding his body, the snow falling, the fire dying, the cabin growing cold. The world, the high, lonely world they had built, was silenced. She buried him 3 days later. The ground was frozen iron. It took her all of one day, using the pickaxe to hack a shallow grave beside the frozen creek. She wrapped him in the bison hide. She dragged his body, a weight that felt impossible, to the grave. She stood over him, the wind tearing at her hair. There were no words. The Bible lay in the cabin, but she had no voice to read from it. She just stood, a lone black figure in a world of white, until the cold drove her back inside. She took a piece of pine, the wood he had been carving into a bird, and finished it. She carved his name, Elias, and the year, 1881. She drove it into the frozen mound of earth. She stayed. The winter locked her in. She was alone, truly alone, with the wind, the snow, and the grave by the creek. She survived. She snared rabbits. She had the cattle, the flour. She kept the fire lit. She sat in the silence, the echo of his voice, the memory of his hand in hers, the only warmth. The grief was a physical thing, a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Some days, she would not leave the bed. She would lie, curled under the hides, staring at the ring on her finger, and wish for the snow to bury the cabin, to bury her. But one morning, in the deep cold of February, she woke with the familiar sickness, the one she had felt once or twice in the fall and dismissed. But it was not anxiety. It was not spoiled meat. She was pregnant. She sat on the floor by the cold hearth, her hand on her flat belly, and a new, fierce, terrifying realization settled over her. She was not alone. She had his child. A small, flickering ember of hope, of purpose, began to glow. She could not die. She had to live for this. The story closes in the spring. The thaw came, the snow melting, the creek breaking free of its ice. The meadow turned a pale, hopeful green. Nora was thin, her clothes hanging on her, but her belly was a small, firm swell under her dress. She was packing. She was mending the saddle. She sat at the small table Elias had built, a piece of foolscap paper in front of her, a nub of pencil in her hand. She was writing a letter to no one, to the world, to him. He was my sin and my salvation. He was the man who saw me when I was invisible. He was the man who fought for me when I had given up. They called me damaged. They called him a killer. Perhaps we were. But the love we found, in this high, lonely place, was more real than any law, any judgment. They took his life, but they did not take him. I carry him. I will always carry him. I regret nothing. She folded the paper and tucked it inside her dress, against her heart. She went to the grave. The wooden cross was grayed by the winter sun. She placed a small, new spring flower on the mound.
I have to go, Elias,
she whispered. I cannot raise our child here, but I will. I will tell him about you. I will tell him he came from the strongest man I ever knew. She stood for a moment, then turned. She saddled Bess, the mare that had carried them both to freedom. She loaded the packs. She gave the cabin one last look. Their sanctuary. She mounted the horse, her back straight, her chin high. She did not look back again. She rode down the narrow game trail, toward a distant, unknown valley, carrying the future inside her, and the memory of a love that had defied the world itself. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments below, so you can connect with fellow listeners. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.